Ah, basketball. It's a beautiful sport. The dunks, the crossovers, the shooting, the trash talking, the speed and passion and intensity at which it's played. It's all perfect. Basketball is among the greatest things that America ever invented. And the fact that we know definitively that it was made in America is actually rather unique, because most sports don't have a clear birthplace, let alone an American one. Sports, more often than not, are the evolutionary byproducts of other sports and games and activities that already existed and that were consciously and unconsciously melded together by different people over a long period of time. It's almost impossible to trace the origins of any classic sports back to a singular moment of invention. It's why most sports don't actually have a founder, never mind a birthday. But that's not the case at all with basketball. With basketball, we know who invented it, where they invented it, why they invented it, and when they invented it. And for that reason, the day it was unveiled should be celebrated. December 21st should be Basketball Day to sports fans, because on December 21st, 1891, a 30-year-old man named James Naismith debuted the sport at a YMCA training school in Springfield, Massachusetts, a school that would eventually change its name to Springfield College. And it's important to note that basketball was invented in the United States, because people do get confused about this more than you'd think they do. Basketball was invented in Springfield. It's why the Basketball Hall of Fame is in Springfield. James Naismith, the guy who invented it, was born in Canada. So Canada can claim the inventor of basketball because he was not a United States citizen at the time that he invented it, but not the place where it was invented. Basketball has always been an American sport. As for why he did it, there's almost no mystery whatsoever, because Naismith wrote an entire book about it called Basketball, Its Origin and Development, which was posthumously published in 1941, a couple years after he died. According to Naismith himself, he was working as a physical educator at the YMCA in Springfield when the head of the PE department, a man named Luther Gulick, assigned him the task of coming up with a new game for his students to participate in, a game that could be played indoors during the winter, when it wasn't practical to play baseball or football, because in lieu of such a game, the students there had gotten restless. And so, Naismith set out to create a new sport, not because he wanted to, or because he had one in mind, but because he had been told to. So he spent most of the next 2 weeks trying to come up with a new, modified version of games like soccer and football and lacrosse, but none of them really worked. Which is why, when he finally reached the deadline for when he was supposed to come up with a new game, he decided to create something that he thought might work if you broke it down to its most basic elements. Because most sports had a ball, Naismith decided his new sport should have a ball. And because Naismith wanted it to be a game that lots of people in a big group could play, he decided it should have a big ball that was light enough that it could be easily moved. And he didn't think the game should require any equipment, like a bat or a stick, because he thought that that would make it more complicated, and he wanted the game to be accessible to all his students. And because he didn't want it to be too violent, he made it so that you couldn't run with the ball. And so, he was thinking about what the player should be trying to do in this game when he remembered an activity that he played in Canada as a kid called Duck on the Rock, in which you're supposed to try to knock off a rock that's on a perch, like a duck, with another rock. And he got it in his head that the students could try to shoot the ball at a target and that the target could be a goal. And because he didn't want his students to just be throwing the ball as hard as they could, he decided that the goal should be horizontal. That way, it would require some finesse in order for them to get it in. And that is how basketball was invented in a day. Naismith created it as a solution to a problem. He laid out all the components that he thought needed to be met for new sports, and he kept building on them one at a time until when he was done, the thing he had stitched together was this totally original thing. And the very next day, December 21st, 1891, he drew up the original rules for basketball and posted them in the gym and had his students play it. And they immediately loved it, and it stuck. And before he knew it, Naismith's sport was not just a global sensation, but an institution, something that you just expect to see everywhere. What's funny, though, is that for all the thought that went into making up the rules of the game, the dimensions of how the game would be played came down to complete circumstance. For example, because a basketball didn't exist yet, Naismith decided that the game would be played with a soccer ball. His students used a soccer ball in the first basketball game ever, and for a while, that was actually the standard. If you've ever compared a basketball to a soccer ball, and if you've ever noticed that they're similar in size, that's because a soccer ball was once upon a time the stand-in for a basketball, back when dribbling wasn't part of the game. Another example is that the whole reason basketball is even called basketball, famously, is because James Naismith hung a pair of peach baskets in the gym for his students to shoot the ball into, and that too became the standard for a bit. However, that was not his plan. His plan was initially for his students to shoot the ball into a pair of boxes, and the only reason that didn't happen is because when he asked the janitor to bring him a pair of boxes, the janitor told him that he didn't have any, but that by total coincidence, he had a pair of peach baskets that he could bring him instead. And so it's sheer luck that this sport is called basketball and not, as it could have or would have been, box ball. Just as it's luck that the rims that you see today are round, like the peach baskets they're based on, and not square, like a box. Even the height of a modern basketball hoop is based on luck. When Naismith went out to the gym on that day in 1891 to hang up those peach baskets, he decided to hang them on opposite ends against the railings of a balcony, because that gym was actually in a basement. And wouldn't you know it, that railing happened to be 10 feet off the ground. If you watch an NBA game, the reason that the players are shooting at a hoop that's 10 feet high is because it is a carryover from how high off the ground the original peach baskets were that Naismith hung in that gym in 1891. As for the details about what happened in the first basketball game ever, Naismith was actually light on some of the specifics in his book, but from most accounts, the first game ever had 9 people on one team and 9 people on the other because there were 18 people in Naismith's class that day. It took a few years for the standard to become 5-on-5. And of those 18 players, most of them were in their 20s. The youngest player was 18, and the oldest player was 32. What's interesting is the first basketball game ever played, apparently, wasn't played all that well, because the final score of it was 1-0. William R. Chase holds the distinction of hitting the first basketball shot in history, which he did after missing his previous shot so badly that it hit some of the other players and bounced back towards him, at which point he tried again and it went in. And that was the only scoring that took place that day. Ernest Hildner, one of the men who played in that game, gave an interview towards the end of his life in which he described what it was like to play in it, and why there wasn't much offense in it. As quoted in the James Naismith biography, Basketball in His Own Words, Hildner said, quote, "There was no time in the game. Nothing. If you could just understand how absolutely everything was gathered around how one side was shoving the ball one way and the other side was shoving the ball the other way. There were so many men that they could not operate. The gym was too small. They couldn't find a place to land. We passed the ball back and forth. That is all there was for a while. We played this game of one side throwing the other side and the other side throwing the other side. It wasn't very pleasant. It was just one side against the other side and smash into the other guy. The other guy would try to pass it and he would get caught and someone would grab him. It was just a game of throwing the ball so as to get in the other fellow's basket." And that was not the only account for just how violent the first game was. because in 2015, a University of Kansas professor uncovered a radio interview that James Naismith gave in 1939, less than a year before Naismith died. And in the recording, which was the first known audio recording of Naismith in history, he actually talked about what a disaster the first game was. So, let's now listen to James Naismith himself describe what happened in the very first basketball game ever played.
Dr. Naismith, how did you happen to invent basketball?
Well, Mr. Heater, it was in the winter of 1891 when I was physical instructor at Springfield College in Massachusetts. We had a real New England blizzard. For days the students couldn't go outdoors, so they began roughhousing in the halls. We tried everything to keep them quiet. We tried playing a modified form of football in the gymnasium, but they got bored with that. Something had to be done. One day I had an idea. I called the boys to the gym, divided them up into teams of 9, and gave them an old soccer ball. I showed them 2 peach baskets I'd nailed up at each end of the gym, and I told them the idea was to throw the ball into the opposing team's peach basket. I blew a whistle, and the first game of basketball began.
And what rules did you have for your new games, Dr. Naismith?
Well, I didn't have enough, and that's where I made my big mistake. The boys began tackling, kicking, and punching in the clinches. They ended up in a free-for-all in the middle of the gym floor. Before I could pull them apart, one boy was knocked out, several of them had black eyes, and one had a dislocated shoulder. It certainly was murder. Well, after that first match, I was afraid they'd kill each other, but they kept nagging me to let them play again. So I made up some more rules. The most important one was that there should be no running with the ball. That stopped tackling and slugging. We tried out the game with those rules, and we didn't have one casualty. We had a fine, clean sport.
So, the first basketball game ever played not only had very little scoring in it, one of the players was knocked out, several of the players had black eyes, and one of them had a dislocated shoulder, which is incredible. There were more black eyes in that game than there were points. That clip is also interesting to historians because Naismith had written that among the original rules of basketball that he posted in the gym before the first game was that you can't run with the ball. And yet in that interview, he seemed to suggest that that rule didn't exist when the first game was played, or at least wasn't implemented. So it's a little hard to navigate the precise truth between those statements. Another thing that's interesting is that of the original 13 rules that Naismith came up with, many of them were created with the intention of limiting contact. Naismith was very concerned with how aggressively he imagined his students might play the game. That's why, if you look at the original rules, there's a giant emphasis on fouls, because he didn't want them to hurt each other. What's ironic, though, is that one of his 13 rules was incredibly counterproductive. Rule 9 of his original rules stated that when the ball went out of bounds, possession would go to the first person who got the ball. And that rule made it so that there was always this mad scramble for the ball whenever it went out of bounds. And that scramble could be very physical. So much so that when basketball was finally played professionally a few years later, it was played inside of a cage so that spectators wouldn't get caught up in the action whenever the ball was near the sideline. Eventually, that sideline rule was changed, but by that point, basketball had become synonymous with cages, and so for years, the standard was for basketball games to be played inside cages, like wrestling, to separate the fans from the players. And even when those cages eventually went away, because it eventually dawned on people that they didn't serve a practical purpose anymore, basketball was so associated with cages that for the majority of the 20th century, basketball was also known as the cage game, or cage ball, and basketball players were known as cagers. It's why, if you look at newspaper clips about what is retroactively considered the first NBA game ever, which was between the New York Knicks and the Toronto Huskies in 1946, you'll see all these references to cages. Believe it or not, it used to be that when people thought of basketball, they immediately associated it as something that was played inside a cage. And that might not have happened without one of Naismith's rules. As for the rest of Naismith's rules, it's interesting to look back at them because as foundational as they were, many of them changed dramatically over the years, to the degree that they're even applicable. There are clips that you can find online of people playing basketball with the original rules, and if you watch those clips, you'll see that the original version of basketball looked pretty different from the basketball we see today. It kind of looked like handball back then. And it's important to keep that in mind because as brilliant as James Naismith was, and as indebted to him as all basketball fans should be, it's also worth noting that if his version of basketball was never changed, basketball wouldn't be basketball. In fact, it wouldn't be all that great. The reason today's basketball is awesome, the reason it has running and dribbling and dunking and three-point shooting and crossovers, is because it was allowed to evolve. Basketball isn't great because of one person. It's great because it kept getting refined and improved upon by lots of people. It's something Americans as a whole kept making better, and eventually exported to other countries who also helped make it better. And that's why the anniversary of the first basketball game in history should be celebrated. Not just because it's incredible that we know when it took place, or that we know the sport was conceived literally the day before, but because it's a testament to American ingenuity. Basketball was created in America, popularized in America, and perfected in America. And, oh yeah, was made specifically for Americans. And the fact that the guy who invented it wasn't an American at the time not only doesn't complicate its legacy, it makes it better. It's actually perfect that the most inherently American team sport of them all was invented by an immigrant, because that captures the spirit of America too. Or it should. American basketball fans, as well as basketball fans worldwide, owe everything to a man from Canada. And so it only seems fair to honor the day that he gave the sport to us. December 21st, 1891. Or, if you want, Basketball Day.